He went into the forest just to gather firewood, but under the roots of an old oak tree, he stumbled upon a secret passage. What his father had been hiding turned out to be far more terrifying and ancient than he could have imagined. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The morning began as so many others had for Samuel Harper, a farmer who had long since surrendered the freshness of youth to the demands of the earth. He awoke before the rooster's crow, stirred less by instinct now than by years of habit, his body knowing the rhythm of chores better than his mind did. He sat on the edge of his narrow bed for a while, letting the cool silence of dawn press against him. The house was old, built by his grandfather's hands, its beams groaning at night when the wind pushed through the hills, but it had endured like Samuel himself, stubborn, weathered, scarred by time yet still standing. His day, like every day, unfolded with simple tasks that belied the effort they required. The chickens needed feeding, their restless clucking echoing in the yard, until he scattered grain and watched them descend like a small storm of feathers. The cows called out from the pasture, waiting for him to draw water into the troughs and check the fences that had begun to sag under years of strain. The dog barked, straining against the rope, its keen nose tilted toward the forest that lay beyond the fields. Samuel moved among them without rush, but also without pause, his body moving as if it carried its own clock inside. The farm, though small, consumed every breath of him. The tractor leaned tiredly against the barn, its paint faded, its body more rust than iron, yet Samuel coaxed it to life when he could. The barn itself, patched a dozen times with mismatched planks, leaned against the sky, as if grateful for the support of the earth beneath it. Every structure bore his touch, from the mended fences to the roof of the shed that had nearly caved in one stormy night. Samuel was a man whose presence was etched into the land, but the land, in turn, had carved him into someone both strong and weary. Life had been stripped down to these repetitions. He had once had a wife whose laughter filled the farmhouse, and a son whose boyish shouts carried across the fields. But those days had passed into memory. His wife had been buried years ago, leaving behind the echo of her voice in the kitchen, the faint scent of bread when the oven warmed, and a silence Samuel had never learned to chase away. His son, grown and restless, had gone to the city, chasing a different kind of future. Letters came now and then, clipped in tone, written by a man who seemed to speak more to duty than affection. Samuel did not resent him for leaving. The land bound some men, but it repelled others. Still, the emptiness had deepened, and the farm had become his only companion. That morning, with the sun not yet risen, Samuel decided he would go into the forest to gather firewood. It was not that he lacked wood. There was always a stack near the house, but the act of going into the forest felt necessary. The chainsaw leaned in the corner of the shed, its body heavy with years of use, its blade dulled by countless cuts. He filled the small canister with fuel, checked the oil, and slung it across his shoulder. The weight was familiar, like carrying a burden that was both tool and talisman. With it, he could split fallen trunks, cut down stubborn limbs, and bring home the warmth of fire. The forest stretched beyond his fields like an endless sea of trees. Its edge was both a promise and a warning. He had grown up hearing his father's words about it. Never go too far. Never disturb what lies beneath the oaks. Never forget that the earth sometimes keeps secrets better, left untouched. His grandfather, too, had spoken in hushed tones about hollow places, though he offered no details, as if speaking more might awaken something slumbering. Samuel had laughed at those words in his youth, but he carried them still. A man could not live this close to the woods without absorbing the weight of their silence. That day, the forest greeted him with an unfamiliar stillness. The air was heavy with fog, its tendrils curling low to the ground, wrapping themselves around his boots as he walked. The usual chorus of birds was absent. Not a single whistle or trill carried through the branches. Even the dog, who sometimes followed him until scolded back, had remained at the farmhouse, unsettled by something Samuel could not name. He walked with steady steps, the chainsaw knocking gently against his back, the fuel sloshing in its small container. His boots pressed into the damp soil, leaving deep imprints that filled quickly with water from the mist. He followed the narrow path he had used all his life, the one that wound through the birches and maples before reaching the heart of the oaks. The farther he went, the stranger the silence became. Broken branches lay scattered in places, as if animals had bolted through in sudden flight. He noticed deer tracks pressed deep into the mud, but they ended abruptly, vanishing as though the creatures had turned back. The forest seemed to lean toward him, each tree a sentinel, each shadow stretching longer than it should. Samuel felt it then, a weight in his chest, not of fear, but of anticipation, as though something had been waiting for him. He thought of the stories again, his father's sharp voice. Do not dig near the oak. Do not listen if the ground breathes. At the time, those had sounded like the warnings of a man trying to keep a boy from danger. But now, as the fog thickened and the forest swallowed sound, the words returned with the clarity of truth. He shook them off, focusing on the simple purpose of his trip. Wood for the fire, nothing more. The chainsaw's familiar shape was a comfort. It was steel, fuel, noise. Modern, practical, real. Whatever lay in the forest could not stand against the roar of its engine. At last, he came upon the clearing where the great oak stood. Even among giants, this tree was unmatched. Its trunk was wider than any he had seen, its bark scarred by storms, its branches stretched like arms over the forest. He had known it since boyhood, had climbed smaller oaks nearby, had played in the shade it cast, but he had never shaken the sense that it was different. Beneath its crown, the air felt heavier, colder, even in summer. Roots twisted outward from its base, some thick as a man's torso, curling into the soil like frozen serpents. It had watched centuries pass, and it seemed to watch him now. Samuel adjusted the strap on his shoulder, eyeing a massive limb that had cracked in some storm and hung dead, ready to fall. It would make good firewood. He bent to set the saw down, his hand brushing the soil near the base of the oak. And that was when he noticed it. The earth was not firm here. The ground had sagged slightly, forming a shallow depression where the roots met. A thin line of darkness cut through the soil, and from it rose a faint draft of cold air. It was not the kind of air one found in open forest. It smelled of stone, of dampness sealed for centuries, and something older still. He knelt closer, his rough fingers brushing aside leaves, pressing into the softened soil. The draft grew stronger, chilling his skin, carrying with it the scent of an underground world. His heart thudded in his chest. He looked up at the branches of the oak, then back down at the gap between the roots. For the first time in many years, he remembered that moment from childhood, kicking the earth near this very tree, hearing the hollow echo beneath, and feeling his father's hand yank him back with a stern command never to dig there. The memory had been buried like a stone under soil, but now it surged with unsettling clarity. The chainsaw rested at his side, its silence heavier than any roar it might have made. He was not here to dig, not here to uncover secrets. He had come only for wood. Yet the presence of that narrow opening, the breath of cold air rising from the depths, demanded his attention. He stayed crouched for a long time, torn between the familiar comfort of work and the unfamiliar pull of something far larger than his world of soil and harvest. His breath clouded faintly in the chill that seeped from below. though the day itself was not cold. Samuel stood at last, wiping dirt from his gloves, his gaze fixed on the dark fissure beneath the oak. He told himself he would return later, better prepared. Firewood could wait, but whatever lay beneath could not remain ignored. The forest, the silence, the old stories they had aligned to bring him here, and he knew with a weighty certainty that his life had shifted in a way he could not yet understand. The chainsaw, heavy across his shoulder, seemed suddenly out of place, a relic of work too simple for what awaited. He turned from the oak, the fog curling tighter as he made his way back along the path. Behind him, the great tree loomed, its roots tangled, its shadow stretching across the forest floor, as if to remind him that it held more than soil within its grasp. He walked back toward the farm, with the knowledge that tomorrow, or the day after, he would return, not as a man seeking wood, but as one answering a call buried in the ground. And thus the forest, which had always been the border of his life, ceased to be only trees. It had become a threshold, and the oak had opened its first secret. Samuel Harper, who had set out that morning with a chainsaw and the simple intention of gathering firewood, carried home something heavier, the beginning of a revelation that would carry him far beyond the rhythm of chores and into the hidden world beneath his feet. Samuel could not sleep that night, though he returned from the forest with the chainsaw still heavy across his shoulder and the rope unused at his side. His thoughts remained entangled in the dark fissure he had found, beneath the roots of the great oak. The simple plan of gathering firewood had dissolved the moment he touched the soil and felt the chill rising from below. He sat long after the evening meal had grown cold, his plate untouched, his hands clasped on the worn surface of the kitchen table. Outside, the farm breathed with its usual rhythms, the cows lowing softly in their shed, the chickens rustling in their coop, the dog pacing restlessly on the porch. But Samuel felt cut off from it all. His mind lingered in the hollow air that had drifted upward from the earth. It smelled of stone, of secrets, and it pulled at him with an intensity he could not shake. He rose before dawn, as was his habit, though this time it was not the call of chores that lifted him from bed. He moved through the familiar motions, feeding the animals, checking the troughs, walking the fence line near the pasture, but his hands worked without his mind. The cows pressed close, nudging him for grain, but he hardly noticed. His eyes turned again and again toward the forest, toward the shadow of the oak that loomed just beyond the reach of his fields. By the time the sun broke above the horizon, he had already made his decision. He would return, not as a man searching for firewood, but as one prepared to face what lay beneath. In the barn, he gathered what tools he thought might serve him. The chainsaw he left leaning against the wall, its silence a reminder of yesterday's purpose, but one he no longer required. Instead, he took an old lantern from a shelf, its glass clouded but still sound. He cleaned it carefully, filling its belly with oil until the wick shone wet. Into his pocket he slipped a handful of matches. A coil of rope, frayed but strong, he looped around his shoulder, and with it he carried a small hand shovel, thinking the soil near the oak would yield more easily to its edge than to his bare hands. Gloves thick with years of use covered his palms. He thought briefly of his father's words again, warnings once dismissed as superstition, now remembered as cautions with weight. They no longer rang in his ears as prohibitions, but as challenges, as though the voices of the past demanded that he test their truth. The walk into the forest felt different this time. Yesterday he had stepped into it, with the practicality of a farmer seeking fuel. Now each stride carried a purpose that pressed against his chest. The trees stood tall and silent, their trunks fading into the mist like pillars of some ancient temple. The forest floor was damp, muffled beneath layers of leaves that had fallen and decayed, forming a thick carpet that silenced his steps. Birds called faintly in the distance, but nearer to the oak, even they grew quiet, as though unwilling to break the stillness that hung in the air. The farther he walked, the more he felt the atmosphere shift, a heaviness that settled on his shoulders and slowed his breathing. It was not fear that gripped him, though unease tingled in his skin, but rather a sense of inevitability. When at last he reached the oak, it stood before him like a sentinel. Its trunk rose impossibly wide, its bark dark and ridged, and its roots twisted outward like frozen serpents. The soil at its base seemed even more disturbed than the day before, as though the night had loosened it further. Samuel set down his tools and crouched near the gap he had uncovered. The draft still rose from below, cold and steady, carrying with it that same scent of age and stone. He pressed his gloved hand against the soil and felt it crumble easily, too soft for this part of the forest. He dug slowly, pulling clumps away, widening the fissure. The shovel bit into the earth, lifting stones and roots that broke under its edge. Sweat gathered beneath his collar, though the morning air was cool. Bit by bit, the opening widened. Beneath the roots, the outline of stone emerged, blocks not rough and fractured like natural rock, but shaped, fitted together with deliberate hands. Samuel paused, the realization sending a tremor through him. This was no burrow, no accident of nature. Someone, long ago, had placed these stones. He leaned closer, brushing more soil aside, until the gap was wide enough for him to peer inside. Darkness stared back at him, but it was not empty. His lantern flickered as he held it near, the flame catching faintly on walls that sloped downward. The stones bore grooves, their edges softened by time, but their pattern undeniable. It was a corridor, narrow and deliberate, leading deeper into the earth. The draft grew stronger as the gap widened, pushing against his face, cool and damp. It carried the smell of long-forgotten spaces, of places sealed from sunlight for centuries. Samuel felt his pulse quicken. His father's voice returned again, warning him never to dig near the oak, never to listen if the ground breathed. For a moment, he considered retreating, leaving the soil to close over the gap once more. But the thought of walking away felt hollow, impossible. He had already uncovered too much to return to ignorance. The forest had revealed its secret, and he knew he could not turn back. He sat back on his heels, breathing heavily, the dirt staining his gloves, his shirt damp with sweat. He looked up at the oak towering above him, its branches creaking faintly in the wind. It seemed to watch him, to test his resolve. He reached for the lantern, struck a match, and lit the wick. The flame flared, steady and bright, throwing its glow across the rough soil and the gaping hole at the roots. Shadows stretched outward, long and wavering, as if the forest itself recoiled from the light. Samuel adjusted the rope across his shoulder, tied one end around a thick root, and lowered the lantern into the opening. Its glow spread along the stone walls below, illuminating the beginning of a passage. The sight filled him with awe and dread in equal measure. The stones were rough but fitted, their edges marked with faint chisels, their lines too purposeful to be natural. The corridor sloped downward into blackness, promising more than he could see. He lowered the lantern further, watching as the light faded into the depths, then pulled it back and held it close to his chest. His decision was made. He would go inside. He would see for himself what lay beneath the oak that had haunted his family for generations. Samuel widened the gap further, enough to fit his shoulders, clawing at the soil until it gave way beneath his hands. The earth seemed reluctant to release its secret, but he pressed on, pulling stones free, shifting roots aside. At last, when the hole was large enough to admit him, he lowered the lantern into the passage, took a deep breath, and crawled forward. The roots of the oak formed an arch above his back, their gnarled forms twisting like fingers that threatened to close around him. The soil brushed against his arms, damp and heavy, until he emerged into the stone corridor. The air inside was colder still, pressing against his skin, filling his lungs with the weight of centuries. The silence was absolute, broken only by the scrape of his boots against the floor and the faint hiss of the lantern flame. The world of the surface, the rustle of leaves, the distant lowing of cattle, the hum of insects, vanished the moment he entered. Here, beneath the oak, he felt the earth itself pressing down, a silence so deep it seemed alive. He moved cautiously, the lantern swaying in his hand, casting wild shadows along the walls. Each step carried him further from the life he had known, deeper into a darkness that pulsed with mystery. He paused often, crouching low, letting the silence settle before taking another step. The corridor was narrow, his shoulders brushing the walls, the ceiling low enough that he had to stoop. The stones were damp, glistening faintly in the lantern's glow. Drops of water clung to them, falling now and then with a hollow echo. The passage stretched onward, sloping further into the earth, its end unseen. Samuel's chest tightened, but he pressed forward, driven not by courage, but by something stronger, the compulsion to know. He could not retreat now, not when the truth lay so close at hand. When the passage opened at last into a chamber, Samuel stopped at the threshold, his breath catching in his throat. The lantern revealed a small room carved roughly from the stone, its walls etched with faint markings, its corners dark with age. The ceiling hung low, forcing him to stoop further, but the space was deliberate, intentional. This was no natural hollow. It had been built. He stepped inside, the crunch of loose stones underfoot echoing through the silence. The walls bore grooves, faint carvings, lines and circles that seemed to repeat like a forgotten language. Niches cut into the stone held nothing now but blackened streaks, as though candles or torches had once burned there. Samuel reached out, his fingers tracing one of the grooves. The stone was cold, the cut deep enough to survive centuries, and the touch sent a shiver down his arm. The realization struck him with full force. The stories of his father and grandfather, the whispers of hollow places beneath the earth, had been true. Here, beneath the oak, lay the remains of something ancient, a secret deliberately hidden. He stood in the chamber, the lantern's light flickering across the walls, and knew with certainty that his life had already changed. He was no longer only a farmer tending his fields. He was a trespasser in history, a man who had stepped into a world buried and forgotten, a world that now demanded he uncover its truth. Samuel stood in the small chamber, lantern held high, his breath uneven as he tried to absorb the enormity of what he had discovered. The markings on the walls seemed to waver in the flickering glow, some carved in steady, deliberate strokes, others hasty and shallow, as though made by hands pressed by urgency or fear. The blackened streaks above the niches told of flames that once lit this space, shadows that had danced along the stone when men gathered here for purposes lost to memory. The dust beneath his boots felt untouched for centuries, disturbed only now by his cautious steps. The silence pressed harder against his ears, thicker than the stillness of the surface. It was as if the chamber itself listened, holding its breath in expectation. He knelt and brushed his gloved hand across the floor, uncovering fragments that crumbled at his touch. A shard of wood, so decayed that it nearly dissolved into powder, lay half-buried among the rubble. Beside it, a sliver of clay curved gently, the remnant of some vessel that once held food, drink, or perhaps something more sacred. Samuel lifted it carefully, holding it close to the lantern, marveling at its faint texture, its fragile edge. It was not the work of nature. It was the work of people who had once lived, hidden, and remembered beneath this very oak. A shiver ran through him as he set it back, the weight of history settling heavier on his shoulders. The chamber was not large, its ceiling pressed low, the air damp and cool, but it was no mere accident of erosion. It had been shaped, carved deliberately to shelter or conceal. Samuel turned slowly, the lantern beam sweeping across the walls until it revealed another passage branching off at the far side. The opening was narrower than the one he had entered, its edges rough but purposeful, chisel's marks still visible despite the centuries that had worn them. His pulse quickened. The decision lay before him: to retreat into the safety of the known world or to step deeper into the unknown. He felt the pull of the surface, the thought of fields waiting for his hand, animals awaiting his care, the farmhouse standing lonely in the dawn. But that life now seemed distant, like a dream he could not re-enter. He had stepped into this place, and with each breath he took, it claimed him more fully. He crossed the chamber with slow, steady steps, his boots grinding softly against the grit. The lantern flame trembled, throwing shadows that reached like fingers along the stone. The opening yawned before him, dark and unyielding, its depths hidden. He lowered the lantern closer, and the light spread across a corridor that sloped downward once more, its walls pressed tight, its ceiling forcing him to stoop. Samuel tightened his grip on the handle, adjusted the rope still slung across his shoulder, and drew in a breath that felt heavier than any he had ever taken. Then he stepped into the passage. The corridor pressed close around him, narrower than the first. The walls were damp, their surfaces glistening in the lantern's glow. Water dripped from the ceiling at intervals, each drop striking stone with a hollow sound that echoed faintly ahead. His shoulders brushed against the rough edges as he walked, his boots scraping against the uneven floor. The air grew colder with each step, the chill seeping through his clothes, raising gooseflesh along his arms. The smell was stronger here, a thick blend of damp earth, stone, and the unmistakable tang of something ancient, something sealed away too long. Samuel moved cautiously, his breath loud in the silence, the lantern casting a fragile circle of light around him. Time seemed to stretch in the passage, every step an eternity, every breath a reminder of how far he had descended from the world above. He paused often, pressing his hand against the stone for balance, letting the silence settle again. It was not the silence of empty space. It was the silence of something waiting, of walls that had absorbed voices, footsteps, prayers, and secrets, and now held them suspended. His father's warnings echoed faintly in his mind, but they no longer carried the power of deterrence. They felt instead like echoes of knowledge withheld, of truths too heavy for words. Samuel pressed forward, his lantern bobbing in rhythm with his stride, his shadow stretching long and distorted behind him. At last, the passage widened, spilling him into another chamber. This one was larger than the first, though still not generous in height. Samuel had to bow his head, the lantern raised above his shoulder, to see the breadth of it. The walls here bore carvings far more intricate than those in the smaller room, deep lines, etched spirals, intersecting circles, and crude figures into the stone, patterns repeated, as though they carried meaning. He stepped closer, his gloved fingers hovering above the grooves before finally tracing them. The sensation was unsettling, as though he touched not just stone, but the echo of the hands that carved it. Each symbol seemed to pulse faintly in the wavering light, whispering of stories no longer spoken. Along the walls, shallow benches had been cut into the stone, worn smooth by time. Samuel imagined men sitting there, gathered in silence or in ritual, their faces shadowed by torchlight. The blackened stains above the niches confirmed it. This place had once glowed with flame, the chamber alive with flickering light, smoke curling toward the ceiling. At the center of the floor lay a shallow depression, circular and deliberate, its edges too even to be chance. He crouched beside it, running his hand along its rim, shivering at the thought of what it might have held. Perhaps a fire, perhaps offerings, perhaps sacrifices, made in a time when the world above was less forgiving. His grandfather's words returned then, half-remembered tales of rituals, of gatherings to honor seasons, ancestors, or something darker still. Samuel had dismissed them as superstition, but now, kneeling beside the hollow in the stone, he felt the truth pressing down. He rose slowly, his breath clouding faintly in the chill. The lantern flame flickered, shadows stretching across the benches, until for an instant it seemed as though figures sat there once more, watching him with patient eyes. Samuel blinked hard, and the illusion faded, but the impression lingered. He told himself it was exhaustion, the strain of his journey, but deep down he knew the chamber carried memory, heavy and unyielding. The stones themselves seemed to remember, holding impressions of voices, movements, lives long extinguished. He stood in the center, lantern raised, feeling both intruder and witness, both trespasser and chosen. On the far side of the chamber, another passage waited, its mouth narrow and dark, its edges carved with the same grooves. The air seemed colder there, the darkness thicker. Samuel hesitated, torn between the desire to retreat and the compulsion to know more. His thoughts turned briefly to the surface world, the cattle grazing in the pasture, the fences needing repair, the fields awaiting harvest. But those images felt unreal, like fragments of another life. Here, beneath the oak, he had stepped into a different story, one written long before his birth and meant to outlast his days. To leave now would be to abandon questions that would haunt him forever. He could not return to ignorance. He crossed the chamber again, his boots crunching softly against the stone floor, the lantern casting its light ahead. The carvings faded into shadow behind him, but their presence lingered, etched not only into the walls, but into his mind. He paused at the threshold of the new passage, staring into the blackness that swallowed the lantern's glow. The silence deepened, pressing harder against his ears, until even the faint crackle of the flame seemed loud. He tightened his grip on the lantern, steadied his breath, and stepped forward. The passage closed around him once more, its walls slick with moisture, its ceiling low enough to brush his head. Drops of water clung to the stone, glittering like faint jewels in the dim light. His boots echoed softly, each step swallowed quickly by the heavy silence. He moved slowly, one hand brushing the wall, the other holding the lantern high. The air thickened as he descended further, a faint metallic taste clinging to his tongue. The cuts in the stone were clear here, deep and purposeful, evidence of men who had labored long in the dark, shaping the earth with tools and determination. Time became meaningless in the dark. Samuel did not know how far he had walked, how deep he had gone. The lantern flame grew small, its circle of light fragile against the vastness of shadow. His arms ached from holding it aloft, his knees throbbed from stooping, but he pressed onward, the compulsion to uncover outweighing the fatigue in his body. He thought of the fragments he had seen, the clay vessel, the charred wood, the carvings, and felt the questions gnawing at him. Who were these people? Why had they built these halls? Why had they hidden them beneath the roots of the oak, sealing their world away from the light of day? When the passage opened again, Samuel froze at the threshold. The lantern's glow spread across a vast chamber that dwarfed the ones before. Shadows leapt wildly across towering columns, carved from the same stone as the walls, rising from floor to ceiling to hold the weight of the world above. The sheer scale of it stunned him. This was no hurried refuge, no small shelter carved in secret. This was a hall of vision, a hall built with purpose. The carvings here were larger, more intricate, spirals and lines intersecting in patterns that seemed to demand meaning. Samuel stood in awe, the breath caught in his throat as he stepped into the great underground hall. Samuel stood at the threshold of the vast hall, his lantern quivering faintly in his hand, as though the flame itself recognized the magnitude of the place. The light stretched upward and faltered before reaching the ceiling, leaving the farthest corners veiled in darkness. The towering columns loomed in solemn stillness, their stone surfaces etched with designs so intricate that the patterns seemed alive in the shifting glow. Every breath Samuel drew felt cold, as though the air itself carried the memory of centuries. His boots echoed softly as he stepped further inside, each sound swallowed quickly by the immensity of silence. He moved slowly, the lantern's glow sliding along the bases of the columns. Carvings spiraled upward, crude yet purposeful, telling stories he could not read. At intervals, the floor dipped and rose, worn smooth in some places, jagged in others, as though generations of feet had once moved here with unbroken rhythm. The central space drew him onward until he reached a circular depression in the stone, wider than a man's reach, its rim polished smooth as though countless hands or offerings had touched it. He crouched, setting the lantern beside him, and traced the edge with his gloved fingers. The hollow seemed to breathe faintly in the stillness, exhaling a chill that numbed his skin. He thought of fire once burning there, of voices chanting in the dark, of gatherings that bound men not only to one another, but to something deeper, something older than the oak above. His mind reeled as he stood again, lifting the lantern higher. The shadows leapt across the chamber, forming shapes that resembled figures seated upon the stone benches carved along the walls. For an instant, he saw them clearly in his imagination. Faces painted, hands lifted, eyes gleaming in the firelight. He blinked hard, and they vanished, leaving only dust and carvings behind. But the impression lingered like a weight upon his chest. He was not the first to stand here, nor would he be the last, though the centuries had stretched long between. The thought of leaving pressed at him suddenly, the urge to return to the surface, to the open air, to the safety of light and the familiar world. Yet the path back seemed longer now. Heavier. He had come too far, seen too much. To step away would be to abandon this place to silence once more, to turn his back on the truth his family had always feared, yet never dared to name. He pictured the farm waiting above the cows lowing for water, the chickens pacing in their coop, the fields in need of tilling. They felt impossibly distant, like fragments of a life that belonged to another man. The Samuel who had walked into the forest with a chainsaw was not the Samuel who now stood in the hall of stone. He lingered for a long time in the great chamber, his lantern sputtering as its oil began to thin. At last, with heavy steps, he turned and retraced his path through the narrow corridors. The carvings passed once more under his hand, the echoes of his boots following him like whispers of farewell. When he reached the smaller chambers, he paused again, touching the grooves, collecting fragments of clay and laying them gently back, unwilling to disturb the balance of what remained. Each step upward seemed to weigh more than the one before, as if the earth itself resisted his departure. But at last he reached the fissure beneath the oak and pulled himself upward, emerging into the damp soil and the pale light of the surface. The sun had risen high above the forest, though its warmth seemed dim to him now. He lay for a moment on the ground, breathing deeply. The oak's massive roots sprawled around him, the sky vast and open. Yet the air felt different, thinner, less certain. He pushed himself upright and looked once more at the opening. The draft still rose from it, faint but steady, carrying the breath of the depths below. He considered for a long time whether to seal it again, to cover it with soil and leaves, to let the forest reclaim its secret. But the thought of doing so filled him with unease, as though he would be betraying not only the past, but the responsibility the place had pressed upon him. That night in his farmhouse, he sat again at the table, lantern dark beside him, the silence thick. He imagined the arrival of archaeologists, scholars, and men with machines that tore the soil open. He saw flashbulbs bursting in the hall, voices echoing where chants once rose, the columns reduced to curiosities, the carvings catalogued and forgotten in books. The thought twisted his stomach. This place had survived because it had been left alone. To expose it would be to strip it of meaning. It would no longer be sacred, only studied. The world would consume it, as it consumed everything it touched. Yet to remain silent carried its own burden. He was a solitary farmer, his life measured in crops and chores. To keep such a secret felt like shouldering the weight of centuries. But perhaps that was the very point. Perhaps the oak had waited for him, not to reveal its depths to the world, but to choose someone who would guard it. His father's warnings returned, no longer as deterrence, but as recognition that each generation had been aware of the truth, yet had turned away. Samuel was the one who had stepped inside. He was the one who had seen. As the days passed, the knowledge settled deeper into him. He tended his animals, walked his fields, and repaired his fences, but always with the sense that the earth beneath him pulsed with hidden life. Every furrow he cut, every stone he lifted from the soil, reminded him of the halls below. The farm was no longer just his livelihood. It was the surface of something older, greater, more enduring. He began to think of himself less as a farmer and more as a custodian, a man chosen not by birthright, but by chance, or perhaps by fate, to protect a secret. Often he returned to the oak, sitting at its roots in silence, listening to the faint draft that still whispered upward. He did not descend again, though the urge never left him. Instead, he placed his hand upon the bark, feeling the slow pulse of the tree, the steady endurance of its life. The chainsaw he had once carried so casually now leaned forgotten in his shed, its teeth dulled, its body stained with rust. It had brought him here, had set him on the path, but it no longer belonged to the man he had become. His hands were no longer meant only for cutting wood and tilling soil. They were hands meant to guard. Seasons shifted around him. The leaves of the forest turned gold, then fell in russet drifts. Winter came, its snow blanketing the fields, the oak standing tall and bare, its roots hidden beneath frost. Through it all, Samuel kept his silence, carrying the secret like a flame within him. He told no one, not even when his son's letters came, sparse and hurried, speaking only of city life and obligations. To share the truth would be to invite ruin. To protect it meant bearing the solitude, and so he bore it, as he bore the farm, as he bore the years. In time, the choice no longer felt like a burden, but a calling. The oak remained, vast and eternal, its shadow stretching long across the ground, and beneath it, the halls slept undisturbed. Samuel understood at last what his father and grandfather had tried to tell him. Some truths are not meant for the world above. Some truths are meant to be kept, not out of fear, but out of reverence. He had become their keeper, not by oath, but by the inevitability of discovery, and in that role, he found a strange peace. When he stood at the oak once more, the chainsaw resting silently at its base, he pressed his palm against the bark and closed his eyes. He felt the thrum of life, not only of the tree, but of the depths below, the memories carved into stone, the voices still lingering in silence. He was no longer simply Samuel Harper, the farmer of fields and cattle. He was the guardian of something older than his family, older than his town, older perhaps than memory itself. The forest had chosen him, and he accepted its charge. And so the world continued above as though nothing had changed, while below, in the silence of stone and shadow, the past remained. The oak kept its secret, and Samuel kept his vow, a man bound not by words, but by the weight of discovery. His days would end as they began, with soil beneath his hands and the sky above. But his life had been joined forever to the darkness beneath, to the truth that waited, silent and eternal, in the heart of the earth. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are more powerful stories you won't want to miss. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.